The sound of a chainsaw tearing through my trees ripped me from a dead sleep. I ran outside, heart pounding, only to find my land, my life, reduced to nothing but stumps and broken roots. Every single tree gone. They didn't even bother to warn me. The HOA had sent a crew to clear my land while I was away. I stared at the wreckage, fury burning in my chest. No papers, no consent, just a bulldozer and a mission to erase everything I loved. But then a text popped up on my phone. It was all approved in writing. They said it was legal. I never signed a thing. So who gave them permission? Barbara Hastings, the HOA president, was everything you'd expect. Polished, condescending, and with a smile that never reached her eyes. She rolled up in her silver Lexus pearls around her neck, and her poodle Muffin trotting beside her like a prop in her perfect little world. She handed me a list of rules before I could even blink, the kind of rules that made no sense for a ranch, but were apparently gospel to her. We don't allow livestock over 300 pounds, no unapproved fences, and modifications to the landscape must be approved in writing, she said, voice sweet but cold. I told her I had livestock. It's a ranch, I reminded her. She smiled wider. Of course. But you're inside Maplewood Ridge's district now. All the same rules apply. She handed me a stack of papers like she was doing me a favor. It didn't take long for me to realize Barbara wasn't just some neighbor with a clipboard. She was the gatekeeper, pulling strings, enforcing absurd rules that made no sense. And when I pushed back on her fines and violations, she made it clear that she wouldn't be challenged. Her authority, unquestionable. And when the trees went down, I knew it wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated move. But why? What was Barbara really after? It started with the smallest of things, the kind of nitpicking that made you feel like you were living in a bureaucratic nightmare. I'd been in the ranch for a month when I got my first violation notice. Excessive exterior lighting on the barn, the letter claimed. It wasn't excessive, just a few floodlights on timers to light the path when I worked late. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a fluke. Then came another. Visible hay stacks from the road. Really, I was trying to keep a couple of bales near the barn for winter feed, but apparently that was an issue. Still, I tried to comply, moving them to the back of the property. The last straw came when I received a fine for having 2 horses on the property. Unapproved livestock. I couldn't believe it. I called Barbara. These are my horses. I have the right to keep them. But she was unmoved. I'm sorry, Mason. Rules are rules. It's part of the Maplewood Ridge HOA guidelines. If you don't adhere, you'll continue to face fines. I'd had enough. This was my land, my home. I wasn't going to let some woman tell me how to live my life. I started pushing back, attending HOA meetings, showing them my deeds, and even getting a lawyer to review the zoning. I made it clear if they wanted to take me on, they'd have to do it the hard way. Barbara didn't like that. She didn't like being challenged, and she definitely didn't like being made to look bad. A few weeks later, I received another notice. This time it wasn't just a fine. They were sending a crew to inspect my trees. It was the first time I'd heard mention of the trees. At first I figured they were just being their usual overbearing selves, but when a truck pulled up the next day with a bulldozer in tow, I knew something was off. I grabbed my boots and headed outside to confront them. A man in a blue uniform stepped out. "We're here to clear these trees," he said, checking his clipboard. I froze. "What trees?" "The ones overgrown on your property. We were told to remove them. Approved by the HOA board." He waved the clipboard at me like it was some sort of holy document. I marched over to him. "Approved by who?" My pulse raced. I never signed anything for this. The man's eyes narrowed. "You'll need to take it up with the HOA board. We've got the paperwork." Something about his demeanor rubbed me the wrong way. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. He was following orders, but those orders weren't coming from me. I called Tom, my neighbor, and asked if he'd seen anything. He was in his garage, and he hadn't heard any plans about tree clearing. When I asked if they'd shown him any paperwork, he hesitated. I tried to ask, but they just ignored me. They said it was all approved. "Didn't you get the notice I hadn't?" Not a single piece of mail. I felt the rage building up inside me. This wasn't just harassment. This was an all-out attack on my property. And someone from the HOA had authorized it without my consent. I wasn't going to let them touch my land without a fight. I went straight to the HOA office to confront Barbara. It was a small, neat building with a fresh coat of beige paint and a pristine porch. But as soon as I walked inside, I felt the cold, sterile atmosphere that seemed to emanate from everything they did. The receptionist looked up from her desk, clearly startled by my sudden appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat. "I need to speak to Barbara Hastings," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "I need to know why your crew is cutting down my trees without my permission." "She's not in right now," the receptionist said a little too quickly. Then who the hell is running this place? I shot back, not in the mood for games. I want answers. Now. She flinched but nodded, disappearing into the back office. It took nearly 15 minutes before anyone came to speak to me. A man in a wrinkled suit, clearly out of his depth, stepped forward. I'm Ron, legal compliance for the HOA. Barbara isn't available, but we're aware of the incident with your trees. I didn't give him a chance to finish. You're aware. Well, who authorized it? Because I sure didn't. Ron shifted uncomfortably. There's been a misunderstanding. The trees were removed because they were deemed a safety hazard. It's part of a land beautification project. We have all the paperwork approved by the HOA board. I leaned forward, fury building inside me. I don't give a damn about your beautification project. Those trees were over 100 years old. They were protected, and I've got the documents to prove it. You had no right to touch them. Now where the hell is Barbara? She's busy, Ron stammered, looking for a way out. Look, Mason, this is a misunderstanding. The trees were a liability. Just fill out the grievance form and we'll misunderstanding, I shouted, the rage finally spilling out. You've destroyed my property. You've destroyed my land. And now you're trying to cover it up with some bullshit paperwork. Before I could say another word, Ron raised his hands defensively. I'm just following orders. Take it up with Barbara. She'll be in touch soon. I stormed out, knowing this wasn't over. They had crossed a line. They thought they could do whatever they wanted, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next day, I got a knock on the door. I opened it to find 2 officers standing there holding a piece of paper. We've received a complaint, one of them said, flashing his badge. You're being cited for violating community codes. I blinked in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. The officer handed me the paper. This is a formal complaint from the HOA. They're claiming your property is in violation of zoning regulations and that you've been illegally altering the land. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. You've got to be kidding me. I've never done anything to violate zoning codes. I haven't changed a damn thing. But it didn't matter. The officer's hands were tied. He had to follow up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The HOA had manipulated the system to escalate things, and now I was being dragged into a legal mess I didn't even know existed. Later that afternoon, I found the final blow. While walking the property, I noticed a white van parked near the edge of my land, hidden behind some trees. Curious, I walked over. Inside the van were tools, saw blades, fuel tanks, and a clipboard. I saw a map marked with red X's across every tree cluster on my property. But what stopped me cold was the name at the bottom of the map, Henry C. Ballinger. Who the hell was Henry C. Ballinger? Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find a man in a blue shirt, the HOA logo stitched on the chest, walking toward me. His expression was cold, his voice calm. You're not supposed to be back yet, he said, like he was giving me a warning. I asked him who gave him permission to cut down my trees, and he simply shrugged. Take it up with the HOA board, he said, then got into his van and drove off. I stood there, numb, staring at the map. The name on it wasn't mine, and the trees, the land I fought for, weren't mine to protect anymore. It was their game now, and I had no idea who I was really up against. But one thing was clear, the battle had only just begun. The courtroom was packed with tension, the air thick with the kind of quiet you only hear right before a storm. I stood at the front, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me, neighbors, witnesses, even Tom still recovering from the attack. Barbara Hastings sat across the room, her usual confident smile replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. She sat beside her lawyer, her pearls gleaming in the harsh lights, but I could see the cracks forming beneath her polished exterior. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, banged her gavel, signaling the start of the hearing. This is a case about land rights, fraud, and corruption, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. Mr. Reed, you may present your evidence. I took a deep breath and turned to the judge. Your Honor, what we have here is a clear case of abuse of power. The HOA president and her associates have used fraudulent documents to take control of my property. They destroyed my trees, my land, and they tried to steal my home. The evidence is irrefutable. Barbara's lawyer tried to intervene, but the judge silenced him with a sharp gesture. It was obvious she was already tired of his obfuscations. She turned to Barbara, who seemed more nervous now, her fingers tapping on the table in an anxious rhythm. Miss Hastings, do you have anything to say in your defense? Barbara's lips tightened, but she remained silent, her eyes flicking to the folder of documents. I'd submitted photos, emails, legal records, and the key piece of evidence, the fraudulent zoning application that linked Barbara and her husband to the comma. Shady land deals. I stood firm as I handed over the evidence. The courtroom went silent, As the judge skimmed through the documents, her brow furrowing as she read the emails detailing the fake company names, the forged signatures, and the illegal land transfers Barbara and her husband had orchestrated. Barbara's lawyer sputtered, trying to regain control. "Objection. These are circumstantial." The judge didn't let him finish. "Sustained," she said, her voice like steel. "The documents are admissible." The crowd was quiet, but I could hear the murmurs of disbelief spreading among the audience. The evidence was damning, not just for Barbara, but for the entire HOA system that had turned a blind eye to her actions. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as Barbara's facade crumbled. The lies she'd built her empire on were being stripped away layer by layer. I didn't let up. "This wasn't just about trees," I said, my voice gaining strength. "This was about control, about stealing from everyone. They've done it before, and they were going to do it again. But I won't let them get away with it." Barbara's face reddened, her mouth opening to say something, but the words didn't come. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, knowing that her game was up. Her lawyer fumbled with his papers, clearly realizing the inevitable. But it wasn't just Barbara who was going down, it was the entire system that had protected her. The judge slammed her gavel down again, signaling the end of the proceedings. "This court finds in favor of Mr. Reed." The HOA's actions were not only illegal, but also an abuse of power. The zoning changes the land, seizures, and the destruction of private property will be investigated immediately. Barbara's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her lawyer sat back defeated. I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of victory. The fight was far from over, but this was the turning point. The truth had come to light. "You're hereby removed from any further involvement in HOA matters, Miss Hastings," the judge continued, her voice resolute. "This is no longer a civil matter. This is a criminal case. You're under investigation for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy." The room was silent for a moment before murmurs of shock and disbelief spread like wildfire. It was over. Barbara Hastings, the queen of the HOA, was finally being held accountable for the chaos she'd caused. As I walked out of the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. Finally, the truth had won. But I knew this was just the beginning. The war wasn't over, and there were more battles ahead. The fire wasn't out, and the fight for my land, my future, was only just starting. The courtroom doors swung shut behind me, with a sense of finality, but the weight of it all didn't quite hit me until I stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The air was cool, the sky a soft blue, but inside I felt a storm brewing. Barbara Hastings was gone, her empire of lies crumbling, but the land still stood in ruins. I glanced across the field that had once been home to my cherished trees. They were gone, but not the memories. I could still see the maples in my mind's eye, their leaves dancing in the wind. I could still hear the sound of their branches swaying. That part of me was lost forever. But as I stood there, a strange sense of peace settled over me. My land, my ranch was still here. It wasn't over yet. The town had been watching, and now they were behind me. As I walked back to my truck, the locals who had gathered around the courthouse offered their silent nods of support. There were no more whispers, no more side glances. It was as if the whole town was waking up, realizing they didn't have to live in fear of the HOA anymore. Tom, my neighbor, was one of the first to reach me. His face was battered, his eyes tired, but there was something else there too, a fire. "Mason, we did it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. His voice broke the tension in the air, making me smile. "Hell yeah, we did. It's not over though." I nodded. I'd been fighting for months, and I knew the battle wasn't finished yet, but for the first time, I felt like we were winning. It didn't take long for the dominoes to start falling. The investigation into the HOA began almost immediately after the court ruling. The FBI was brought in to look into the financial records. Barbara Hastings and her husband David were both taken into custody, charged with fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The full extent of their schemes came to light: how they'd been siphoning HOA funds into shell companies, how they'd been using the HOA as a front for private development deals. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. The town was shaken by what had happened, but there was relief too. For years, people had lived in fear of the HOA's power. Now they saw that things could change. The city council called for a full audit of all HOA activities, and the board was replaced. They brought in a new group, people who understood the community's needs and who had no tolerance for corruption. The rest of the board members who had blindly followed Barbara resigned in disgrace. As for me, the legal battle was far from over. There was still the matter of the eminent domain seizure notice and the illegal zoning changes. But with the truth now on the table, those battles felt winnable. I had hired a new lawyer, someone who wasn't afraid to dig deep and go after the money trail. Together we filed a suit to have my property removed from the HOA's jurisdiction once and for all. The suit also sought restitution for the damages and fines I had unjustly incurred. The lawyer assured me that it would take time, but we were on the right path. A few weeks after the court case, I stood on the front porch of my farmhouse as the sun dipped below the horizon. The property was quieter now, the dust settling on a long-fought battle. Dakota and Spirit were grazing peacefully in the pasture, their tails flicking lazily as the wind swept over the land. I could still feel the scars of the fire, the empty patches where the barn had once stood, but it was getting better. Slowly but surely. I had just returned from a town meeting where the community came together to discuss what had happened. People were finally speaking out, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had tried to squeeze them out. One woman, Ellie, even came forward with a hand-drawn map from the original zoning committee, showing the land boundaries before the HOA had made its shady changes. That map was the final piece of evidence we needed to prove the HOA's corruption. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. We had fought this battle together, and now we were rebuilding together. The barn was halfway reconstructed, with new beams being put up and fresh paint being applied. Volunteers from the town helped, some offering labor, others donating materials. Even Tom, still bandaged from the fall, had joined in, sitting in a lawn chair and cracking jokes while the rest of us worked. It felt right, like the town was coming back to life, just like the land was. But then a letter arrived at my gate. No postage, no return address. It was addressed in bold letters, to the man who beat us once. Inside was a deed to a nearby plot of land. Franklin Development Group was listed as the new owner. Beneath that, in typed letters, was a note. Consider this the first of many. You may have won this battle, but the war over Maplewood Ridge, that's just getting started. I stared at the paper, the words blurring for a moment. This wasn't over. They weren't done. But I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. I looked out across my ranch, the land that had been fought for, that had been burned, that had been almost taken from me. I smiled a slow, determined smile as I walked back to the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't know who was behind this new threat, but they would soon learn. This ranch was mine, and I would fight with everything I had to keep it. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew I was going to win.